podcast growth is usually really slow. And I think a lot of people will tell you it's one of the hardest mediums to grow. One of the things I've found is the best podcasters that actually end up really growing, they don't focus on growth and the sort of like tactics that much. They really focus on the content and finding that uniqueness, that creator content fit, and then why they're unique in terms of bringing it.
Hello and welcome to Marketing Speak. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer. It is my pleasure to have Sachit Gupta with us. Sachit, widely known as the Creator Whisperer, is a top podcaster and business consultant who helps podcasters, creators, brands, and businesses build, grow, and scale online platforms to millions. Over 10 years, he's helped over 100 creators generate millions in revenue and subscribers, built multiple top-ranked podcasts, and been behind the scenes for multiple #1 New York Times bestsellers. He's got platforms media. He's worked with clients like Rohit Sharma, who's captain of the Indian cricket team and Restless Action Drink, Tim Ferriss, whom I'm sure everyone knows, the #1 author and podcaster, and Seth Godin with his altMBA to build podcasts, make money. Sachit's helped grow and scale all of these guys' audiences. He's helped 30 brands, including Toptal, HostGator, and ActiveCampaign, create win-win partnerships with podcasters and creators. Most recently, he built and ran the first and only cohort of the On Deck Podcaster Fellowship. He shares what he learns on the Conscious Creators Show, which is a #25 U.S. podcast within 30 days of launch, and teaches podcasters and creators at the Creators MBA. His mission is to help 1 million creators worldwide. Sachit, it's so great to have you on the show.
Stephan, thank you for having me. After that introduction, I think we're done.
Well, everybody's certainly impressed by now, but we got to get the story behind the story.
Now we got to match that. And also, just want to thank our friend James, who was the one who introduced us initially.
Yeah, he's awesome. And past guest on the show. If we were to kind of look behind the curtain, what kind of Wizard of Oz thing do you have going on there? Do you have hundreds of folks in the Philippines working on all this podcast stuff you're doing? Are you a one-man band who comes in and gives all the answers to questions of life and the meaning of the universe, and then you leave? Or give us a sense of how you work and what is happening behind the scenes when you do all this amazing stuff with your clients.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I would say I spent the first probably decade of my career being more of an independent consultant, which is where I worked with Andrew Warner, Tim Ferriss, and all those people that you mentioned, and never really had more than 5 clients. There's a really great book, E-Myth Revisited, where he talks about, do you want to be the craftsman or do you want to be the business owner?
Yeah. And by the way, Michael Gerber was a guest on this podcast.
I'm not surprised. And for so long, I think I tried to build a business, but really what I wanted to be was a craftsman. And so it was me with a small team of contractors. And probably over the last 2 years, sort of realized the opportunity and what you can create with a team and scale. And so we've started building a small team, and we have a team out of India for production. And at this point, it's okay, how do we scale what we've been doing that we've perfected over the last decade and more?
Awesome. So if we were to kind of hear your origin story, like the superhero origin story, what would it be? What humble beginnings did you come from?
Oh, man. It's funny, actually. It's around 10 years ago, which was sort of the dark period. So I'll tell you, I'll start with right out of college, worked at General Electric and did corporate America. 1 year in, I was this is not for me. So I quit my job and I basically moved to San Francisco, and I said, I'm going to just start marketing and doing consulting. Looking back, probably didn't know what I was doing at all. But what I did was I started just emailing all of these companies and basically offering to work with them for free in exchange for just sort of experience. And then I would get started. One of those people was Andrew Warner at Mixergy. He saw my email and he replied, and that started a relationship doing a bunch of different things for him until I settled on audience growth and sponsorships, and sort of became my entry into podcasting. A few years down the line, it was really interesting because at one point as we all start out, I was working with all kinds of companies. I was working with a podcaster, a ball bearing company in Dubai. I was launching a music video in India. I did marketing for an energy drink in India and all these different things until I decided, okay, I'm going to just focus on podcasters. And I still remember, I remember writing in my journal, at some point, I want to work with Tim Ferriss, right? Because he was the sort of top of the top. A month later, some dots connected in the universe, and I got an email from someone on his team asking if I would be interested because Tim was looking for someone to potentially be his right hand man. And we can go into that story. It's fascinating how that actually ended up happening, which led to working with Tim, which then led to working with Seth. Beyond that, starting my own podcast. So I'll let you pull whichever thread you want to pull on.
Okay, yeah, I want to hear more about the Tim Ferriss story. So, how did you end up getting a reach out from their team instead of you trying to pitch them?
I think one thing that's interesting is like, I think especially in this world, everyone's trying to reach influencers, right? Everyone's trying to reach famous people. Conferences like, can I be on your podcast? Can I do this? Can I do this? And one of the things I realized early on was this concept that I called trusting the generals. And what I realized from working with Andrew is when someone is in that position, they're getting so much inbound that they don't have time to filter it. I still remember we would sometimes go work at this winery in California, and he was doing email. And so he started doing emails at like 350 plus emails in his inbox. He did emails for an hour. And at the end, there was more emails in his inbox than what he started with. And I was like, oh, that is not the way to separate. And one of the things I realized is all those people have people they trust that they turn to for advice. But back when I was in college, there was actually an author, Charlie Hoehn, who wrote this book called Recession Proof Graduate. And he talked about how he used the concept of free work to work with Ramit Sethi and Tim Ferriss and all these other people. And so I emailed him. I was like, Charlie, what is this? I didn't even know you could get these jobs. And I just like sort of like started a conversation. And then I was like, hey, Charlie, I'm pitching Andrew. Hey, Charlie, I got Andrew. And so I just kept him updated. And then I think Tim actually went to him at some point asking if he knew someone else that would be like him that could work with him. And Charlie recommended 3 names. I was one of those names. And that led to an email from Tim Ferriss's team.
It's very funny that you mentioned Charlie Hoehn. So they're no coincidences. I believe that with every fiber of my being. And just a few hours ago, I was interviewing Wendy Paquette, who was a referral from Charlie. He's like, you got to have Wendy on your podcast, which was the other show on Get Yourself Optimized. So we just recorded.
Charlie's the dot connector behind the scenes.
Yeah, but isn't that funny that the one person that he referred to, like, you must have this person on your podcast, Stephan, is somebody I just interviewed today.
Charlie, I would say his book, especially when I look at my early career, like top 5 influences for sure, probably even top 3. Like I basically built my career on the template that he created working with Tim and Ramit.
Yeah, and you're referring to Ramit Sethi.
Exactly.
Yeah. So assume that our listener doesn't know who Ramit is. Like they're not familiar with all these different influencers that you're name dropping, except perhaps Tim Ferriss. So give them a little background on Ramit, and I will teach you to be rich.
Yeah, Ramit is a personal finance blogger. He's probably been writing, I think, since over 20 years. He just launched his show on Netflix recently. And again, I found his book in college. That actually, I think, is what led me to find Tim Ferriss and then just got me into this world. So he writes about personal finance. And then Charlie, he worked with them and then he ended up writing, just people have context, this book called Play It Away, which was about how to introduce play into your life to battle anxiety. And yeah, it's sort of 10 years ago, this world was really small of personal brands. I don't think there was even any job boards. Like you didn't even know that you could get jobs with these people. And it's been really interesting to see how that's blossomed and how so many people have grown and built their platforms and it's become more formalized now.
Yeah. So what would be one of the most important bits of wisdom that you got from any of these guys' books or interactions with them or hearing them speak on stages? What's something that just pops in your mind as like this wisdom has been life-changing, business-changing, destiny-changing for me?
Yeah, so I'll give you one for each of the 3 people that I've mentioned. So I think with Andrew, I very early on learned this sort of like visceral importance of having a reputation. So Mixergy is an entrepreneurship podcast, and at that point, it was sort of basically considered like a rite of passage for Silicon Valley tech CEOs to like be interviewed by him. And I remember one time I was sitting in his office working with him, and he was doing an interview, and he had sort of like revenue requirements, right? And so the person on the other end, I think Andrew said something to the sort of, I don't know if your revenue is enough or whatever. And the interviewee goes, what do you want to see? Tax returns, PayPal, or whatever. Like, I'm ready to show you everything to prove this, right? And that showed me the importance of like having a reputation and how important it is to protect it. Because there's this really great quote from Warren Buffett, which is, "It takes a lifetime to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it." So that was like a huge lesson very early on in my career from working with Andrew. From Tim, I learned I think I really learned what ambition was. So I remember we ended up meeting in 2015, which is when I started working with him. Now that at that time he was still considered like one of the top podcasters, if not the top business podcast. And I still remember very like viscerally again, like in our first meeting, asking him what the goals were, and he said we want to 10x everything. And that led to doing advertising for him, helping him build his email list, being involved in the launch for both Tools of Titans and Tribe of Mentors. And so it was just like this learning that like wherever you get to, there's always a different level, and there's always a different level, and there's always a different level, and how like the best people keep pushing themselves towards that. Working with Tim led to working with Seth, and this was actually a really fun one because I came to the US from India in 2006, and I literally learned marketing by reading Seth's blog early on, right? And so for years, like I've been reading his blog, so it's like he was in my brain. And I remember we started working together, and then the first time I went to the office to work with him, first off, Seth is completely like his blog. You know how like sometimes you feel like maybe the person's not going to match the expectations or your expectation of what they are. He is completely like his blog. I remember the first time I went to work at his office, he goes, "So Sachit, are you staying for lunch?" Right? I was like, "Yes, definitely." And he made us lunch. And so that personality that I knew from the blog was completely the same offline. And I think as this world has grown, there's a lot of people where you see something online, and when you actually meet them, it's completely different. It's almost like influencers have become actors. And so it showed me the importance of authenticity and really like staying true to who you are, because otherwise you end up creating a character that you don't even want to be.
Yeah. Authenticity it's the cornerstone. You were to kind of encapsulate some of the best tips, frameworks, strategies that you have for a marketer who has a podcast or is planning on starting a podcast. What would those growth strategies, those monetization strategies and techniques be?
That's a great question. I still remember when I decided to start my podcast. Our first attempt was really just me sort of taking kind of like different things from different people, cobbling together stuff, and starting to do interviews, right? And we did paid media and ended up launching the podcast, and it hit all these rankings. And it was really interesting because at that point I realized, oh, okay, I'm great at marketing and I can get something to the top of the charts, but what actually makes a great podcast? And I think this was the biggest lesson I've learned in this sort of like content space, especially podcasting, which is it's easy to bring people, but only if you create great content do people stay, right? Because otherwise people are going to shut this off and leave. And that led to really like a deep dive into studying the greats, like all the great podcasts and what makes them different. And I actually came to like sort of like two things. One was this idea of creator content fit. And when I looked at a lot of like top podcasters who have different styles, the common theme actually was the way they were doing the show was completely natural to what they would do offline. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, before Tim started his podcast, he would interview people for his book, and those interviews were just like his podcast, right? He basically took that process of research and turned that into his podcast. Then there's podcasts where there's like two hosts and they're really vibing together and they're sort of like interacting. And what you see is they've been doing that offline for years before they turn to the mic. And so whenever we work with a creator or a podcaster or a business or a brand, the first thing I look for is what is that core thing that you do that just like is completely true to you. Like if I ask your friends, like what is the thing about him that like is very unique? Like for me, it was I'm always asking questions to people. I'm just like the annoying person who's like always curious, asking questions, and that's what I do on my show. And so one is finding that, and the second thing is, and this was a lesson I learned from one of the co-founders of Radiolab. We were interviewing him for that podcast fellowship, and I asked him what separates the people who are just good from the great. And he gave me a really interesting answer, which is very simple, which is the greats rewatch the tape. So when you do an interview, what we do is I'll get the transcript, and I have a very simple framework called the ABCD framework, which is what was awesome, what's boring, what was confusing, and what don't you believe. And I basically look at the transcript and listen to the podcast, every podcast I record through that framework, and kind of like come up with that, like, okay, like these things were awesome. This was kind of like boring, so we should remove that. And that sort of like iteration and repetitiveness is what makes you keep getting better over and over and over time.
Oh, that's a great tip. Did you come up with that framework yourself, or did you learn that from another podcaster?
Everything I'm talking about, 99% is stuff that I've taken from and learned from other people and sort of put together in my own way. I really believe like there's very few new things, and what we do in our careers is we really like take things from here, remix them, and make it our own.
Yeah, we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, for sure.
Exactly. This interview, in a way, is just a homage to all the people that I've learned from.
Yeah, now, if our listener is maybe skeptical, thinking, well, podcasts, maybe they've jumped the shark. I don't know if it's the right thing for me to focus on. Maybe I should be doubling down on my YouTube channel instead. AI is going to change everything. So I'm just in a place of analysis paralysis, or freeze mode, like fight, flight, or freeze, and they're in freeze because they're terrified of what's coming in the future. Like, what do you tell those people who aren't even sure that podcasting is the future, or at least part of it?
Yeah, it's like you see these articles written every year, right? Like podcasting is dead, and I think that article has been written every year probably for the last 10 years.
Just like SEO is dead. That's
exactly, SEO is dead, or like books are dead, or all of these different things, right? So I think my first counter whenever someone says that is, well, do you watch movies and TV shows, or like listen to music? And they're like, yes. And I'm like, well, are there too many movies being made? Are there too many TV shows? Should people stop writing music? And of course, the answer is no, right? Because creativity over time and time horizons and decades changes and really like captures what's happening in the zeitgeist. So the thing that is being created might be the same, but the way it's being created is being different because different stories are being told. So I think in that sense, I still think it's early in podcasting. It's funny, Adobe just came out with a podcasting tool and it's in beta. So one of the biggest companies in the world is now entering the market, right? So really, like I think like for businesses, it's still early. I'm really glad you brought up AI, and because I've been thinking about this, and I'm really curious to hear actually from you like how that's changing SEO, because people can create content en masse. But one of the operating theses I have right now, which is with AI, it's really easy to create content, right? When you go on Twitter, when you go on Facebook or Instagram, I honestly right now can't tell if something that's been written is actual like from the person or AI, because AI has really gotten good. And I think as this keeps getting better and better, one of the things I also look for is like in a publishing platform, like how important is taste and how many people actually create something with taste, right? Because if taste isn't important, if anyone can publish, that means there's going to be this Cambrian explosion of social media content where you don't know what's real. And so at some point, you're going to just stop trusting it, right? And I think in that sort of like world, we're going to go back to one-to-one relationships. We're basically going back to sitting around the campfire and telling stories to people who we trust, and sort of like making decisions based on that, right? Like you said, Charlie reached out to you with someone's recommendation, and because you trust Charlie, we're like, okay, definitely have to have that person on. Yeah. And so for that, I think podcasting, beyond building an audience and all of these different things, podcasting is the best engine of collaboration. Think about any person you want to reach. Maybe someone in your field you want to learn from. Maybe it's target customer. Maybe it's this like company where, if I can just get them as a client, my business will change. Now, let's say you're like writing them a cold email. Hey, can I get 15 minutes of your time? Can I pick your brain or whatever? They're getting hundreds of emails over the year that are the same, right? And they're not going to respond. And then you're just sort of like caught in this en masse of people and trying to stand out. And it's really hard. Now, imagine you send them an email which is, hey, I have this show where I interview the top people in the market. Would you like to come on so that we can feature your story? And I'm sure you've had this experience. What do people say? People say, how much time do you need? They will open up their calendar. They will open up their offices and give you an hour and a half of uninterrupted time to ask them questions, to ask them whatever you want and build that relationship. And so I think beyond just even building an audience, if someone wants to enter a new industry or whatever, I believe podcasting is the best form of creating that collaboration with those people, featuring their story. And then they're so much more likely to answer your questions or help you or connect you to other people.
And start with somebody really big, like shoot for the stars, because if you land that person as one of your early guests, then it's all downhill from there. It's so easy. Not downhill, like it gets worse from there, but it all becomes easier. It's like pushing the boulder downhill instead of uphill. So one of my first 10 guests, or maybe 5 guests for this show, for Marketing Speak, was Jay Abraham. And having him on as one of my first guests made it so easy to get other big name guests because I just name dropped Jay as, I didn't have to talk about the stats of the show because they were terrible. It was a new show. We didn't have many listeners at that point. So then I was able to get a few more big names because of Jay's name. And then just rattling off a few big names, it's like nobody asks me for stats for my show. It's like, yeah, guests have included Jay Abraham, Seth Godin, Dan Kennedy, a few names like that. And it's like, well, wow. Okay.
And right, like as you're sharing those names, right, I'm recognizing those names, and I'm like, one, thank you for featuring me alongside those names, and two, I think this is something that I was even talking to James about, which is at some point you can actually use that positioning now to become the sort of like dot connector in the community, right? Because I think everyone is like, whatever point you reach, you're still looking for relationships. So you could at some point go, hey, Jay and Seth need to do this together. Let me connect them. And when you become that connector within this world, it creates a really powerful dynamic. Mm-hmm. And I think what you said about starting with someone, a bigger name, I think that's so important because one of the things I've learned over the last like 10 years is how important positioning is. And I think that my recent lesson has been, once positioning gets established, it is so hard to shake it or dislodge it unless you go do something crazy, right? Because I don't know when you did your first interview with Jay, but you can still talk about it now with me. And like, I'm like, oh, wow, that's amazing, right? You can mention that in 3 years down the line and say, hi, I started my podcast with Jay Abraham. And as his sort of like influence rises, it reflects well more and more better on your podcast. So yeah, it creates that premium positioning that it's completely like very hard to dislodge unless you go and do something crazy.
Very true. Now you mentioned like AI, Chat GPT, whatever the generative AI that you're using can create articles and content that you'd find indistinguishable from human written content. I'm sure that's in some cases true, but in many cases we're not there yet. I came across an article on Kaspersky.com, which is, the big security antivirus software. And it was on how to stop data brokers from selling your personal information. And I'm looking at that with a client, and we both are just thinking the same thing. This is not written by a human. This is a bot. This is an AI. If I were to fact check an article like that, and because just the way it read sounded artificial, some of the word choices, flow of the article, there was just some weird things that stuck out. Just, it wasn't written by a human. We're both confident of that, me and my client. So it's not going to be forever, but that's where we're at right now. If we keep going down this rabbit hole, which I imagine we will, of more and more and more content being AI generated, that will end up flooding the internet with 100 times, 1,000 times more content than already exists on the internet. And it won't be from humans. It will be auto-generated. So there's no soul in that. There's no real experience. The AI hasn't done brain surgery. It hasn't climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. It hasn't taught its child how to ride a bike. Right? So how can it talk about all these things with such confidence or seeming confidence? It's because it's just selecting word after word after word and stringing that together into an article. But you fact check that's the sources, and some of the sources have been made up, and it's bold-faced lying to you, or it's just stating opinion as if it were fact, or it's giving you a wrong conclusion. So I think all this hullabaloo about AI changing everything and all the writers getting laid off, and and then the podcasters will be next because the AI can also speak, speech to text. Text to speech. So who all is going to be left after the AIs take over all of our jobs? I don't know, but I don't see it as that dire and dystopian.
I completely agree with you. It's a lot of the content almost sounds like this sort of like let's say like you're in high school and there's this sort of person who's been there and hasn't graduated for like 5 years. It's like the overconfident dude who just like tells you everything about the world as if he knows everything, and then you get out and you're like, oh, all of those were just like lies and he was making it up in a sense. And I think yes, there's the value in the content that it creates, but I would argue the same as in podcasting, where the value is in the conversation we're having and the relationship we're building, right? When you're writing content, the value is in actually the synthesis process that's going inside your brain that creates the content and the understanding that you get from it. Yes, you build an audience or whatever, but also you understand something. And with AI, you're not really doing that. You don't really understand the topic that you're talking about. I'll actually give you a great example of this. I had a conversation with a friend a few weeks ago, and I was showing her ChatGPT, and she was sort of like dismissive, like this isn't a big thing or whatever. And I was like, no, like people are really using it. And then she messages me the next week, and she goes, so yeah, we had this like presentation in our company, and these people on her marketing team were giving this presentation, and she starts asking them questions, and they had no idea, right? Because they'd basically made the entire presentation with AI and ChatGPT, so there was no actual synthesis of what they were presenting. And when they got any questions, they had no idea what they were talking about. So in a way, like I really believe like the sort of like mental model I've had for AI is it's like going from having a farm and you have like a bunch of people working on the farm to like really like harvest it, to maybe having a tractor or like some equipment that really helps you do it, right? So like AI is a tool and it can help you with research and all of these different things. But yes, as you said, it's not at a point where it can have the human soul. It might get there, probably will get there, but right now it isn't there.
Yeah. So, what would be a use case for AI that you think is a no-brainer for a podcaster?
So I'll actually give you an example. So we're actually like looking at developing podcasts around AI. So we're pitching a brand that shall remain nameless right now. And so what I did was, one, I created sort of like a pitch for them. We basically use ChatGPT to rewrite the pitch in like different ways. Can you write it in like this person's style? Can you make it more funny or video or whatever, right? So it sort of like is this tool that can help you rewrite stuff. The other thing we did was it's really great as like a sort of the first pass research tool. So for this podcast, we came up with this idea of like there should be all these different topics and different personas and different levels. So it's almost like this like network that we're designing. And so I basically went to ChatGPT and I said, hey, we're building a podcast in this topic, in this niche. It's for these personas. Can you come up with topic ideas that match these personas at these different levels? So it basically created this table, which was persona, the sort of like topic ideas, levels, which is like beginner, intermediate, advanced. Then you can say, hey, okay, like this one's actually really good. Can you expand on this? Can you help create a script for it? I'm interviewing an expert in this topic. Can you give me an idea of questions to ask? Now, can you give me ideas of questions to ask from the perspective of someone who's actually advanced in this field? Can you give me non-intuitive questions to ask this person? So it sort of like becomes this like research tool that's really like a magnifier to all the question, the creativity and curiosity you already have, but you really have to know how to like feed it that inputs to it. And so when we start designing a new show, it really is incredible for that preliminary research that we can do, that we can hand off to clients and be like, hey, here's 100 ideas. Now tell us what you think about these. That work that would maybe take like a week or a few weeks can now be done in like a few days or a few hours.
Okay. So, what would be an example of something that was, it doesn't have to be for a client if you don't want to share privileged information, it could be something that you personally got out of it. Let's say that you figured out the right prompt to use and you got some really valuable insight from ChatGPT or Bard or whatever you were using. So, what would be an insight?
I don't believe we, at least in the way I've used it, the AI is at the point of wisdom, which is like insight. It's more at the point of knowledge. So it's giving you ideas that you can then build on, but it's not giving you the synthesis of like, oh, this is the big insight or this is the big wisdom. At least I haven't used it at that point. I'm curious if you found that actually with ChatGPT or AI.
Well, I'm working on a children's book and I did ask it for different ideas for story arcs and stuff. And there were some interesting ideas that I got. I'm not going to use material from ChatGPT, but it gave me some ways of thinking about twists in the story that I hadn't thought of. So that was interesting. I've tried using it to write intros for podcast episodes, and I might end up, like I did use maybe 30% of what it wrote, just a few paragraphs, but heavily edited. It was helpful for that episode. So I can't say that ChatGPT is something that I'm using constantly, but I've been playing with it, and yeah, there's definitely some opportunities to spark ideas and strategies and tactics and things that would come out of it. Just like you'd maybe go on to LinkedIn and scroll through your feed, and because you interact with a lot of content about AI and search or SEO, and then you get some great ideas from what you see in the news feed. It's not that dissimilar. You're just using a different tool and giving it different input, starting information. All the stuff that you interacted with in the past, the likes and the comments and all that gets fed into the social media algorithms. In the case of ChatGPT, it's really reliant on how you formulate the prompt and where you're at in that conversation with the bot on the quality of what it's going to come up with.
And I think that's, you hit the nail on the head, right? It's sort of like if you're starting a new thing, it allows you to go from like blank page to almost like red pen, where you're like editing and like improving what it's already created, instead of spending like 5 hours with the black pen, like coming up with the initial ideas and then going to the editing mode. It lets you sort of like make that switch much faster.
Yeah, maybe, but I still don't want to over rely on it. I see it as a dangerous crutch if you're not tapped into your intuition for the ideas, for the podcast questions to ask, for the book titles to come up with, and the storylines for these books, and all that sort of stuff that normally would be done using your mind and your connection to the creator, to the universal Google. But now you're heavily reliant on AI to produce all these ideas and headlines and outlines and everything. I think it's a dumbing down of society then that will ensue. Even though the AI is going to get smarter and smarter, humanity will get stupider and stupider and lazier and lazier. It's just like how we can't even add numbers together unless we have a calculator, where we used to be able to do it. At least I personally could do math in my head much better when I wasn't reliant on a calculator. So what's the world going to be like with AI and everybody's reliant on that as much as a calculator for doing simple math?
I think at this point, at least, it's still a tool, and it's up to us how we use that tool, until maybe it gets like to like AGI and all of that stuff, but that's probably ways down the line.
Yeah. Well, maybe not that far down. We'll see. The future is faster than we think. It's the title of Peter Diamandis' book. Anyway, so let's go back to the podcast tactics and strategies that our listener can immediately benefit from in terms of like audience growth and monetizing. What are some things that they can start implementing pretty quickly? Like, for example, should they put their own ads into their podcast episodes? And if so, do they put it at the beginning or somewhere mid-roll or at the end? Do they co-promote, some colleagues' show and vice versa? Do they do podcast swaps where I'll be a guest on your show and you be a guest on mine? Like, what are some things that you would recommend as kind of quick hit, obvious, easy next steps for our podcast listener?
Yeah, I think if you have a podcast and you want to find those listeners, the best place to find is where they're already listening to podcast. And so, in speaking to a lot of like networks and other podcasts that have like really grown tremendously, that really is one of the best ways people are growing right now, which is doing cross promotion and swaps. We've experimented with paid media and a few different things. I think one thing that's interesting that I've seen is, besides a few outliers, right? Like Andrew Huberman, maybe, because he launched in I think Jan 2021 and just has really rocketed. Podcast growth is usually really slow, and I think a lot of people will tell you it's one of the hardest mediums to grow. One of the things I've found is the best podcasters that actually end up really growing, they don't focus on growth and the sort of like tactics that much. They really focus on the content and finding that uniqueness, that creator content fit, and why they're unique in terms of bringing it. Another thing that we've started really recently noticing is the shows that like get the sort of like mass audience really play this dichotomy of creating like really mass content, but with a very specific take or something that is very unique to the person. So, for example, how to make money by these like 7 strategies for X market or whatever, right? And this is how you can save taxes. I think Andrew Huberman is actually a great example where 2 of his most popular topics are around drinking and smoking and how to like stop that and the effects that it has. So it has a really mass appeal, but if you look at, okay, who's got that combination of like Stanford and neuroscience and ability to teach in a really interesting way, he's one of the most unique people who can do that. So he's taken sort of this mass topic, but applied his very unique lens. And whenever those 2 things fit together, is I believe like when things are ready for scale.
Interesting. So what about paid media? How does that fit into a strategy for a podcast host? Because, and typically they're not making a big pile of money. They're not Joe Rogan, so they're not probably even covering their costs. It's just a marketing expense, not a profit center. That would be my guess. So then if that's the case, investing in paid media to drive folks to become podcast listeners versus to become a white paper downloader, because they can easier follow that buyer journey to the white paper downloader and say, oh, yeah, that's going to turn into a sale much more quickly or effectively than a podcast listener. So I'm not spending any paid media money on getting podcast listeners. It's all on getting white paper downloads or webinar signups or whatever the thing is. And I rarely see in news feeds or in search results paid ads that are for podcasts. I'm unusual. I don't think so, but I think it's kind of a hard nut to crack.
Again, you hit the nail on the head. There's really 3 situations where we even work with someone to use paid media to grow a podcast. First one is they already sort of like have a certain audience and they're making money from sponsorships. They really are doing is taking that money, putting that to grow their audience, because if they grow their audience, then they can go back to the sponsor and ask for more. And it really becomes and creates this like virtuous circle where you're getting money from ads, and then you like grow your audience, you get more from ads, and you grow your audience more, and you create this, right? The second is when they've already sort of like established this connection to revenue. So for example, I believe like really like whether you're selling coaching or SaaS software or something else, podcasts are one of the best middle of the funnel tools. So for example, let's say you do a call with someone and then you have another call in a week. If you send them your podcast or a few episodes to listen to, when they're washing their dishes, when they're kind of like going out on a walk or whatever, you're in their ears, right? So it's creating this parasocial relationship where they are spending way more time with you than anyone else, right? Like let's say like you have an hour-long podcast, and if someone listens to 3 episodes in a week, they've spent 3 hours with you in that week. That might be more time than they're spending with their like actual friends, if you think about it, right? So it like creates that relationship. And so when people have created this sort of like direct thing of I'm sending these things and like it's leading to revenue, then they feel more comfortable in investing in growth because they know it creates revenue. And I think the third thing is, and this is very few people have this obviously, where someone's just trying to build something great and build a great show, or they have money already, or they sort of like monetize in a different way, where they just want to reach a bigger audience. Yes, in that case, there's no like direct tie into revenue. They're purely spending to either grow their audience, or in some cases when we launch a show, we try and get shows ranked because it creates a social proof that then you can use to get bigger guests and build those relationships. So really those are the 3 cases in which we do this. I do completely agree with you in the sense that like that connection to your revenue is really hard to establish because of the nature of the medium, because Spotify or iTunes doesn't really sort of like let you track like beyond that. And that's something that's been missing from the medium for a long time.
Yeah, attribution is a hard problem for not just podcasters. It's in the SEO world and many other media. Let's talk a bit about how you grew the Conscious Creators Show. With 30-day launch window, you got to number 25. How'd you do that? What were the steps? What was the difference maker?
Looking back now, because I really like try to sort of break it down, like what led to it. I think the first thing was the sort of like topic selection. where because I'd spent the sort of like goal of the show was, or the premise was, I'd spend 10 years being the business guy behind creators. And so I wanted to have conversations with creators from a business lens, right? Like the business of being creator and the creativity in business. And so I remember like one of the initial episodes was with Sahil Lavingya, who's like a tech founder who started this company called Gumroad. And in that conversation, we're talking about WeWork's S1, which is like finance, to like what makes great design. So it really sort of like eclectic topics with people who've usually been able to jump disciplines. I remember another guest was SJ Murray, and we were talking about storytelling and salsa dancing. And so it's sort of like I was able to like bridge these topics. And one of the things I always look for in a show is what are maybe like three different things that you can connect, because you might not be the best at one thing, but if you have like three very different interests, you can, at the combinatrix of that, you can be sort of like one of the best. And so what is that uniqueness that you bring that we can bring into the show? So I think like it really started with that. I didn't really have an audience for myself because before I launched the podcast, if you went to my Instagram profile, it was completely blank because I was very comfortable being the behind the scenes person with Tim and all of these guys. And so because I didn't have an audience I was launching through, we ended up when going to paid media to launch this. And it's actually interesting because when I initially launched the show, it didn't really do anything. I still remember, I think I launched it on like December 16th or whatever. It got like 20, 30 downloads and episodes, like what usually happens. And I just kind of went home dejected. I was like, wait, is this it? Because I'd come from shows like sort of like doing like millions of downloads, right? And so really like started then like finding people who understood paid media, found someone who did. And I think at that point what we did was we bought ads in a really unique way. One, in terms of like where we were buying ads. So we weren't buying ads on Facebook or Google or whatever. We were buying ads to like networks, and even like if you open an iPhone game app, there would be ad at the bottom to like link to the podcast. So we're just kind of like testing all of these unique strategies to basically take traffic that someone already is looking at something on their phone and connecting that to iTunes or Apple Podcasts. The other thing that we realized during that process was when you think of like the Apple ranking algorithm, it really cares more about velocity than the actual number of growth. So if you're starting with less downloads already and you get like 1,000 downloads versus a show that's established and get that show gets 1,000 downloads, because your velocity is greater, you're going to go up in the rankings. And so it was that combination of things that I think really like kickstarted that. And then I think from there, it was really activating community. Our initial guest was James Altucher, and he was kind enough to actually take the episode that I recorded with him and publish it on his podcast. So that was like one of the best advertising for my interview style, because he really like, he doesn't do that a lot, right? So it was like this sort of, not anointment, I'm forgetting the word, but he was basically like, okay, like this is a good show. And so I think the combination of those things created that this sort of like forever community where everyone was checking it out. I remember we got to like 60, 70 reviews without even like me really like asking anyone to like write a review. And so I think it was a combination of those things that led to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you mentioned that you did some paid advertising. What kind of spend did you throw at it?
Do you have a guess before what it would take to get to like number 25 in the country?
In a category or global, like across all?
So when my podcast launched, I literally have a screenshot, which is, I think, Trevor Noah, my show, then Trevor Noah, then Conan O'Brien. So it was number 25, like in the US.
So how much spent? $100,000.
And this is like, I've actually met people who've done that. We spent less than $5,000 to do that. But it was in the unique way we were buying ads and sort of like the way we were doing it that led to it. Yeah, it didn't actually take that much.
So what made it so effective?
I think the question, actually, I want to flip the question, because for me, it's like, I did paid media for Tim or whatever and did a lot of experiments during that time, right? So like, I've just sort of been building to this. So this is all I know. The question actually, what I ask is like, because I've met people who said they've spent like 50,000 or whatever, and they didn't reach those rankings, or 100,000, like you said, like people who've spent those amounts and still not been able to get to this point. And the question for me is like, what are those people doing that's so ineffective actually? That like, why isn't that working? Because yeah, I've met people, and this is actually the guest that people have. They were like, you probably spent like hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I'm just like, what are you guys doing with that amount of money if like you're not even getting like ranked if you're spending that much on a podcast? I would say, if I were to guess, I think there is a huge element to topic selection, because podcasting is one of those mediums where it's really hard to fake it, right? Because if you aren't curious, if you actually don't have interest in the topic, you get found out. And I think actually, in a sense, like TikTok is very similar because TikTok is all about the energy that you're feeding into it. And so I would guess it was probably also something about the energy that I was bringing to it, because even in my mind, right, like I was coming from behind the scenes to like being in front of the mic for the first time. So we really put a lot of like heart and soul into it. And like you were talking about the SEO content, I think people can tell when like what intention something is coming from and when there's soul in it. And I think that does matter still. I think that matter, like soul in marketing still matters.
Yeah.
Whatever the other internet marketers tell you.
Okay. So my guess, if someone had $100,000 budget to spend on launching a podcast just for the promotion of it with paid ads, I would guess that they would spend it on podcatcher apps.
Mm-hmm.
So like the podcast app is one I'd probably spend some budget with, and Overcast, and I don't know. I would start there probably.
Yeah, and I think I'm really looking for like where is the people that you're trying to reach, where are they already hanging out, right? So they might actually be more in a community of whatever. Let's say like you have a real estate podcast, right? And there's like a real estate association that has 40,000 members. I wouldn't even look at like Facebook ads. I would go, what do I need to do to get everyone in that real estate sort of like association, if there's like 40,000 people, to go and download an episode within the shortest amount of period for launch, right? Because that's going to create that fervor, that's going to create that community, that's going to lead to that sort of like velocity of growth. And I think the interesting is like if someone had $100,000 budget, I would say, even before you talk about marketing, what do we need to spend to make sure that the show is great? Because yes, getting ranked is great and all of these different things, and it creates positioning. But what really matters is not like who comes, but who stays. And that goes to the resonance and an affinity that you can create with your show. I'll actually give you another example. We did the launch for a show in Germany last year with another creator, Alicia Beluga, who actually was also introduced to me through James. So James is a whole huge part of making this happen. And in her case, we spend probably 5 to 6 months working together first, nailing down the show concept. So we did like interviews, we did like maybe like her having a co-host, her like doing like a solo show. And we tried all of these concepts to really like get to something where she felt comfortable doing it. And then we created a Facebook group where we put like some people in her community. Then we started like testing episodes. What do you think of this? And we got feedback. And so we spent so much time like making sure the show was great, so that when we launched, we basically used paid media almost as a accelerant, right? Like, and you know this, like if you have shitty messaging and shitty content, the best paid media strategy cannot save you, because it's going to bring traffic, but no one's going to stay. And so we use paid media as an accelerant, but we also use our community. We had like unique ways to activate the beta group and people in our community. And it was really interesting because within a week, she got over 100 reviews across Apple and Spotify. She was getting messages of people that she hadn't heard from like years being like, this show is so amazing, and people were crying. And that's the point where your show becomes something that actually not just like people listen to, but people share with other people. And that's the holy grail. And if you can hit that, then you're great.
Yeah. So what do you do to get people to share your episodes?
Build something great.
Yeah, but so give me a specific example
share
of what you built that was great, that people just went crazy for.
I'll give you one. We did an interview recently with Sam Ovens, who was the founder of consulting.com, and he hadn't done an interview for a long time. And so I can tell you a little bit about like how we do our podcast too, which is when I decide to have a guest, the first thing I look for is like, what is the unique angle to the story that I can tell that hasn't been covered everywhere else? There's a really great quote from Sally Hogshead, which is, different is better than better. Mm-hmm. I use it all the time. It's like it drives so much of what I do.
I love Sally. So she's awesome. Yeah, she's been a guest on this podcast as well.
You've got all the great guests. I should like ask you afterwards of like guest recommendations for our show. And so I use that quote all the time. It drives like everything I do in marketing, right? So like the first thing I did was I listened to a lot of the shows that he's already been on, because what that does is it sensitizes me to that information. And if he's telling me the same thing over the interview, I'm going to be bored because I already know it, right? So it's like that the stuff that you've already covered is out. The other thing we do is, and this is really unique, and I would say this is where like it's unique to me and my process. If someone else did that, it wouldn't work as well for them because maybe they don't want that. So what we do is we actually do references. So we ask every guest to fill out this form and provide like 3 people 3 or 4 people that they know, that know them really well. And so then we reach out to those people and ask like a series of 5 questions to get really deep into what topics the guest would know about, right? So for example, let's say I'm interviewing someone and I just met them. I don't have that deep relationship to know like what questions to ask them. But if I go to someone who's worked with them for 3 years and I go, hey, what should I be asking him? That person's going to give me like question examples from that depth of that relationship. So we really like collate that together. Then what I try and do is always try and ask the first question based on something like that, like they haven't been asked before, and maybe it's related to like a friend. So for example, like with Sam Mubbins, my first question was, you recently had a baby, and this is a question from Jesse, who works with you. How do you think about integrating like family and work, right? And he was just like, oh wow, haven't heard that before. And then it just completely opened up the interview because he knew it wasn't just going to be like a series of like questions he's already heard. And I think that created like a really unique interview where it was really interesting. Like people I hadn't talked to in years again were like, this is the best Sam Mubbins interview or whatever. Like they started reaching out to me. We got lots of comments saying this is on YouTube, which is this is the best interview with Sam. He got messages from people saying this was like one of the best interviews you've done. And it was actually, YouTube is an interesting platform that we're now learning. We didn't do anything on YouTube. We just posted it and it's over like 10,000 views. And I think it really like came from creating that unique content and spending most of our time actually like figuring out what to ask him and what to like talk about.
Wow. That's cool. That's a lot of work. I don't do any prep for any of my interviews. If I'm interviewing somebody, I don't read their book. I don't go online and start watching their videos. None of it. I just tune into my intuition and let the questions come through me.
And you know what's interesting is like that actually is the essence of what we're talking about, right? Because what you just described is the most unique process for you that works for you. And this is where like you have your creator content fit. Because if you try to like do the research that I do and maybe like had like a whole like document in front of you, you wouldn't be able to tap into your intuition because you'd be like distracted by the document. And so, and I think this again, like it's so important to find that uniqueness of what you do best and doing it that way instead of copying it from someone else and then trying to be someone you're not.
All right. So this was awesome. I really enjoyed our conversation here, and I know we gotta wrap things up. But if our listener or viewer, if they're watching this on YouTube, if they want to work with you, if they want to do some of the cool stuff with sponsorships and paid media and all the growth hacking that you're doing in the podcasting world, how do they get in touch?
So if you're a business or a brand that wants to sort of like enter podcasting and build something together, I run sort of a boutique consultancy called Platforms Media. So that's just platformsmedia.com. And then if you're a creator who wants to increase their revenue, grow their audience, we have more of a coaching program called the Creators MBA, which is where we really like, what I envision that going into is like the best B school for online creators in the next like 5-10 years. So that's on creatorsmba.com. And then if you want to reach me, I am at Sachit, so SACHIT at platformsmedia.com. And then Sachit Gupta, which is SACHITGUPTA on most of the socials.
Awesome. Which social are you most active on?
None of them.
Okay.
That's sort of like I've tried to do it. I never get into it, and I'm actually exploring potentially just turning all socials off and seeing if I can grow this without social media. Haven't made that decision yet, but I'm very inspired by Cal Newport and sort of like how he's building things.
He was a guest.
You've had everyone on.
On my other show on Get Yourself Optimized. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, he's awesome. Well, this was fun and inspiring. So listener, take some of this and apply it in your business this week. Don't just like passively listen. We'll catch you in the next episode. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, signing off.